Hello, welcome, and thank you to everyone who's joining me here today on our live stream as we start some conversations around creating anti-racist schools. My name is Michelle Casten Magbanua, pronouns she, her, and I am a volunteer with the Canadian Cultural Mosaic Foundation. I also have the pleasure of being your folks' host for tonight's conversation. So I think it's really best if you folks get to know me just a little bit. I am a second-generation Filipina-Canadian, born and raised here on Mohkinstsis, also known as Calgary. I currently hold 2 degrees in both drama and education, as well as a minor in French, obtained from the University of Lethbridge. I'm currently a teacher with Rocky View School Division, and I teach elementary French as a second language. In my spare time, or even in the classroom, honestly, anytime you see me, I'm singing or dancing. I also love to read and write in my journal. And as corny as this sounds, I love to learn and grow. So I'm very excited to do that with you folks tonight as we have these conversations. So thank you so much again for everyone who has joined me as we learn a little bit more about creating anti-racist schools. I would like to begin tonight's conversation with a little land acknowledgement. And so I know these land acknowledgements have become very regular, typical and standard in events such as these, or meetings, or maybe at the beginning of your day when you are in the classroom. But I find with a lot of these land acknowledgements, the value and the importance are often lost in the copy paste and kind of reading off of the slide, or it just becomes something that we say and do without really understanding or remembering the importance and the value of land acknowledgements in the first place. So I would like to preface this land acknowledgement with a little personal story of my own and the history of how colonization has affected me and my peoples. So as I tell you a little bit more about this personal story, I invite you folks to also reflect on your relationship to the land. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm Filipina-Canadian, so my family comes from the Philippines. And the Philippines has endured over 300 years of colonization from various groups of people. So our land, culture, and identity were taken away from us, and colonized ideals, as well as corruption and oppression, were put in place instead. So the narrative that was given to the Filipinx people was to kind of assimilate, become more like the white man, as well as leave the home country to find a better life and better opportunities for the family. And that's exactly what my parents did. So in 1993, my parents immigrated here. And then so me and my siblings were born here. And the hope was for us to have a better life here and better opportunities. Things that, basic needs that honestly, at times I take for granted. So clean running water or fresh air, things like toilet paper, or even just a sense of family and community, as well as more privileged things. So access to higher education, where I learned more about the history of colonization in the Philippines, as well as learned more about decolonization. So I am forever grateful to my parents, as well as my ancestors, for all the sacrifices that they have made. I would not be here in front of you folks today if it weren't for them. As a result of me being born here, I now have a severed connection to the land of my people, my culture, my language, and my identity. And I now have this mixed identity of having been born in Canada, but having been raised by immigrant parents. And so as I embark on my decolonization journey, I understand that colonization affects us all differently. But at the end of the day, I am still a guest on the land that I call home. So, in the spirit of respect, reciprocity, and truth, we honor and acknowledge Mohkinstsis and the traditional Treaty 7 territory and oral practices of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika, the Kainai, the Piikani, as well as the Stoney Nakoda and Tsuut'ina nations. We acknowledge that this territory is home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3, within the historical Northwest Métis homeland. Finally, we acknowledge all nations, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, who live, work, and play on this land, and who honor and celebrate this territory. Thank you all for allowing me to share my personal story about my relationship to the land that I live on and that I call home. I would also like to acknowledge that today is Martin Luther King Jr. Day. So for those of you who do or do not know who he is, he was a revolutionist whose work was rooted in anti-racism. So you know what? His words and his actions sparked a lot of tough conversations. And his words and speeches, the most famous one being the I Have a Dream speech, inspired people to take action. And so when deciding a day to have this event, this conversation on anti-racism, Iman and I decided on today because we wanted to be really intentional. And so I really hope that in the spirit of Martin Luther King Jr. and all that he believed and stood for, this conversation will be the start or maybe just a small stepping stone in your anti-racist journey. So I hope that this inspires us all to do just a little better. So thank you again for being a part of this conversation and taking the time and energy to really start making a difference. Before we begin, I would like to turn the microphone over to Iman Bukhari, who is the founder and CEO of the Canadian Cultural Mosaic Foundation.
Thank you, Michelle. And thank you everyone for joining us. I'm really, really excited to hear from the panelists. We're the Canadian Cultural Mosaic Foundation, and we're just a bunch of volunteers, millennials and Gen Z, because we're awesome generations that are essentially working to improve race relations through education, technology, arts, and meaningful dialogue. And this is an example of the meaningful dialogue. And I'm super excited about this event. And, you know, of course, it being this awesome day today, we were able to host this today, and I'm super happy about that. But also, I also wanted to let everyone know, and you can see this little banner at the bottom here, about Culture Commons. So we launched this project after 5 years of incredible work. Over 100 volunteers put this project together, culturecommons.ca, and it's essentially a web hub for teachers to dismantle systemic racism within their classroom. So once you go on this website, culturecommons.ca, you will see so much amazing stuff out there by grades, by subjects that you can introduce thousands and thousands of resources. And this was essentially created through a research study that we did with 150 Alberta teachers that found that actually we need to do something about racism within the classroom. So this was kind of our way of trying to help with that. So I really, really encourage all teachers to check out culturecommons.ca. And thank you so much for giving me the time. And I'm just so excited to hear from our panelists.
Thanks, Iman. All right, now I think it's time to get started on the conversation. To set the tone, I would like to give just a little definition of anti-racism, because I know a lot of the times definitions and terms and stuff can get bogged up. So just so we're all on the same page, let me give you a little definition. Anti-racism is a process of actively identifying and opposing racism. The goal of anti-racism is to challenge racism and actively change the policies, behaviors, and beliefs that perpetuate racist ideas and actions. Anti-racism is rooted in action. It is about taking steps to eliminate racism at the individual, institutional, and structural levels, so that power is redistributed and shared equitably. With that being said, I would love to finally introduce our panelists for tonight's conversation. Our first guest is Dr. Sonia Aujla-Bhullar. She is a scholar, researcher, and educator with a PhD in curriculum and learning. As a public school teacher and published author, Dr. Aujla-Bhullar has studied and researched the unique aspects and challenges of inclusion and diversity within Canada through understandings of post-colonial and critical race theory in education. Her past and present work focuses on anti-racism as an institutional practice and applications of diversity, inclusion, and equity between schools and racialized communities. Welcome, Dr. Sonia.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Of course, honestly, thank you for coming. Our next guest is Mr. Courtney Walcott. So Courtney Walcott was elected councillor for Ward 8 in Calgary during October of 2021. Previously, he was a teacher and basketball coach at Western Canada High School and a community organizer who worked on numerous anti-racism initiatives within education, including with our organization as a volunteer. So welcome, Courtney, and thank you so much for coming tonight.
Absolutely. Happy to be here and happy to see the advertisement for Culture Commons just across that bottom.
Yes, absolutely. And our third and final panelist for tonight is Ms. Chantal Chagnon. Chantal Chagnon is a Cree Métis singer, drummer, artist, storyteller, actor, educator, facilitator, social justice advocate, and activist with roots in Muskeg Lake Cree Nation, Saskatchewan. She shares traditional Indigenous songs, stories, culture, history, arts and crafts, and teachings, and has presented in numerous classrooms from preschool through university. Chantal is passionate about building awareness and sharing understanding of Indigenous culture, spirituality, social justice, and political issues. So welcome, Chantal, and thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Hi, Miigwech. Thank you for having me.
Hello. So hello to all our lovely panelists. And again, thank you to everyone who is joining us on our live stream. I would like to let you folks know that there will be a question period at the end where if you would like to ask our three panelists any questions you may have about education or anti-racism, you can do so by chatting on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube Live, and then I will be reading questions out as we go along. So let's get to it. I think we're all waiting for this. This first question, I think, is something that will kind of just get the dialogue going. It's quite generic. And this is, if anyone feels called to answer this or is just inspired, you go ahead and then you can riff off of each other. And we'll see what goes from there. So how does one begin anti-racist teachings and conversations? What do those who are nervous about this work need to know?
I can definitely take that to start. I think the work actually has to start within. You have to realize your own biases, you have to realize your own interpretations, and you have to realize, like, we're all community, we're all in here together. So in Cree, we always say all my relations because we realize we're all related. We all have the same need, which is, you know, to be loved, to be included, to be welcomed in, to be ourselves. And by recognizing those biases within ourselves and breaking those down, holding ourselves accountable, that is step one before you hold someone else accountable. Because you need to, well, it's just like if you're on an airplane, you put on your own mask first before you try and help anybody else out. But it definitely starts within, and then it starts within your own home. And then eventually it will transmute into your community, and then further. It starts small. It's like when you throw a pebble into a pond. You know, it starts with a small ripple, and then eventually that ripple will escalate out into waves. So be aware of what kind of pebble you put into that ocean.
Okay, I completely agree with what Chantal has said. It really does begin with your own position as a teacher coming into the classroom, but really in your own life and what you inherently bring in terms of your identity. That can be both have its benefits and challenges. But really it's important as teachers and in our classrooms and schools to recognize that we also have persons, those being our students, that are in the classroom with us sharing that space. And for them, they are also bringing in their identity and their position, and they may not have the space or the platform or even the words to articulate what that means, but we all feel that. And so when we feel racism, when we feel the lack of human dignity being afforded to those markers of our identity, that's when we can address any nervous feelings that we're having or trepidations around working with this, because it really comes down to our students themselves know this. And so as teachers, as administrators, or whoever's in that classroom, recognizing that centering the students and their experiences and their voices is how we all move forward together in creating that community. I don't think this was in my bio, but just a little bit of background too. I'm also on leave right now as a public school teacher, but I have taught everything from kindergarten to grade 9. And with my work as an English language learning leader with the Calgary Board of Education right now, that's something that really has come up quite often with students who are learning to express themselves in English, right? Or wanting to say everything that they know, but then the language itself is something that they have to come up against. And I think that's really telling to how we just overall as society and as community, we all have something to say, we all have something to contribute. And anti-racism is the action of being able to create that space where we all can speak in a meaningful way and be heard and listened to.
And to honestly just build on the two amazing answers that were already provided, it really does, like I echo so much of it, because it does start with yourself. And whenever I speak to especially teachers who are nervous about this work, I always ask an honest question about, well, why do you want to do it? And, I start there with that honest question of why do you want to do it? And do you even want to do it? It helps to actually really just sparse out some of the rationale and some of the biases that maybe you're not asking yourself about. So I think a lot of this, and especially in our current present, like our day and culture right now, is a lot of this work seems obligatory versus actually something that we're choosing for ourselves, and we're choosing for our classrooms, and we're choosing for our profession, and we're choosing for our own growth. So I've always asked people to honestly reflect upon themselves and say, like, hey, okay, like, do you actually want to do this work? And what's really powerful about that too, very few teachers will say no, but those who actually, even if it's a takeaway question, like if their answer is no, right, internally, they didn't say it aloud, but it's internal. From there, you actually have a very powerful exploration to go through, which is, okay, well, why don't you, right? And it's in those moments of seriously questioning of yourself that I think you get to the core of why this work is so important, and it will start to create that significance within the work that will all of a sudden move some of that nervousness out of the way, because you start to realize the power that comes from within this choice to do this work, this choice to be present, this choice to represent the students that are in your classroom, and to be honest, the choice to grow. So it really does start there.
Wow. Some powerful answers that came from all three of you folks. Of course, we're all in this conversation together, so I completely agree with you that it starts within. As I mentioned in my definition of anti-racism, it really doesn't start, but it's at the individual, structural, and institutional levels. And so I find a lot of the times with educators, or just our people in general, is, the expectation that it starts from the top down. And yes, that is true. There needs to be change happening from the top down with those who have more power. But I think we often forget the power of the individual and the power of coming together as a community, as Chantal mentioned, and seeing how that small pebble in the pond, and maybe tiny pebbles, will create such a great ripple effect. So thank you all. My next question is specifically for Courtney. And of course, Dr. Sonia and Chantal, if you would like to join along or riff off of Courtney's answer, you are so welcome to do so. So Courtney, how do you recommend uplifting Black student voices in the classroom or school setting?
To be honest, it goes two ways. Because on one hand, I think the easiest thing to do is actually just representation at its core, right? I don't think there's I think quite often the answers that you'll get from people who are not fully prepared for this work, it falls along the lines of tokenism, right? It's culture days. It's this inauthentic approach of trying to create this automatic representation through some event, some show. And the problem with that, though, is that if you're not actually a part of the culture that you're trying to represent, you end up leaning on stereotypes, even if they come from the most positive place. So instead, I challenge educators to actually figure out, okay, what do you value in the curriculum landscape? And then what stories might you provide that are equally as valuable as the traditional canon in English, or the narratives that you'll find in social studies, or really in any of the work, right? Where do you find that authentic story that represents the outcome that you're trying to achieve? And then just actually teach it, learn it, figure out what the nuances are, study the technical value of it, understand the context behind the story, and teach it. You teach it just like you teach everything else. You're not actually coming into class today saying, I'm going to teach a Black story. No, you're coming into class to say, I'm going to teach a valuable story. And there, as a student, you're just sitting there learning, and you're like, oh my God, I see myself in this. And I speak not only from experience, of course, as an ex-teacher. Well, I guess you're never really not a teacher, but one of the largest, I think one of the most impactful moments I've ever had with like teaching students, especially because I often teach what I love and I teach a lot of Black stories, was Anansi Boys by Neil Gaiman. And the shock and awe when the class found out that the main character that was never actually described, the main character was never given a race. Instead, the race of the character was determined via cultural markers planted throughout the story. When they finally figured it out, they all of them questioned themselves. But the ones that understood the cultural markers, they saw themselves in that story. And we talked about it. We talked about that story was for them, even if it wasn't for someone else, and that's okay, because that is the experience of being in the Western world school system. Is where if you are a person of color, if you are a Black student, you often don't see yourself in the story, but you accept it as normal. So then when all of a sudden the teacher just comes out and teaches a valuable story and you see yourself in it, that's how you feel seen. I think those are the moments when you feel valued, more so than just say like culture days or hip hop dance class in gym.
Yeah, Courtney, thank you so much for that. I've actually never read the book, but I remember you telling me that story early on when I was kind of just asking you just about your experiences as a Black educator. So thank you again for sharing that story. I think there's a lot of power that we have as educators to really instill the value of curiosity in students to kind of push forward. And of course, being educators ourselves, where we are in this position of power, it's really important for us to adopt the growth mindset and acknowledge that we don't have all the answers, that we're learning just as much as the students are. So what a great way for us to demonstrate that we as educators are still learners too, than by learning more about the cultures that we aren't necessarily a part of, but would like to do right by and teach.
Can I jump in here for just a moment too? I think, Courtney, what you've talked about is so important, and it's so intrinsic to how schools are set up right now as well. We've talked a little bit already about how it starts, like it can be the individual. And as a teacher, I know there's been many times where especially in my beginning days as a teacher, wanted to close the door and teach so I can just focus on the students, the content, the concepts, and not have to worry about any of the other administration, pushback or nervousness around how parent communities would feel and all of that. But this is really telling, especially around coming up February, we have Black History Month, right? And as an individual teacher, my last 15 years of teaching, I have made it a point to really make that visible. But with that as well, it's been my own journey as a teacher, but also understanding that we cannot exist in 1 month. We cannot exist in what, Courtney, you talked about, a culture day, right? Like I can't be just a Punjabi Sikh woman in April because that's when Vaisakhi and the parades are happening around the country, right? It's really coming back to that point of our students coming into the classroom, bring their world into the classroom. Who do you have in front of you? Who are they every day of their lives? And if they aren't represented in the curriculum, in the topics and the concepts that we're bringing out, then we are cutting them off to go exist in a private sphere or after school somewhere here, or just with someone that understands. So I get really full of angst around times when we see things. I'll tell really briefly. My son right now in a middle school just went through a culture day, and he came home and he said, "Oh, Mom, there was culture day and I didn't know." And he's 11 years old in grade 6. He's like, "And everyone was dressed up. I was supposed to dress up." I'm like, "Okay, what were your teachers wearing?" He's like, "Oh, what they wear every day." I'm like, "So whose culture and what are we trying to talk about? Where's that conversation coming and going?" Because my son was like, "I have my culture and I didn't wear my outfit." I'm like, okay, that's not really the culture that we're talking about. And then he had the question afterwards, what are my teachers' cultures? So there's that chasm, there's that divide where teachers, are we seeing our students that are in the classroom? But then also students, who are they seeing? What are you speaking to? How are you bringing that in? So existing in a month or a day, it really damages our whole concept of belonging in school. And that's just something that I recently went through right before the break with my own son and Culture Day. But I will stop there and I'll pass it on to you, Chantel. Go on with that.
No, absolutely. I mean, representation, that is so, so important. We want to see more racialized educators. And there's some barriers within the system itself, within our institutions themselves, that for some reason we're not getting as many racialized individuals in those roles. And I mean, a lot of that has just been that systemic racism and that colonial mindset and just the colonialism of the structure itself, which has kind of been pushing us down. And so how are we supposed to represent that to our children? How are we supposed to give them hope if they're not seeing those faces and hearing those voices, or even recognizing their own voices? So I go into many, many different schools and I teach traditional Indigenous ways of knowing. And for some of the kids that they don't even tell their teachers, they don't even tell the system that they are Indigenous until I step through that door. And then by the time I leave, they're like, I'm so proud. Did you know I'm Métis? Or did you know I'm Cree? Or did you know I'm Blackfoot? And their teachers are like, whoa, wait, no, we didn't know. But sometimes it just takes those mentors stepping forward and giving those kids hope that, yes, it's okay to be who I am. I could be proud of who I am. I can be proud of the blood that runs through my veins. I don't have to be tokenized in my costume to be proud of the teachings that I carry, to be proud of the culture and my ancestors who have survived so much to let me thrive in this moment. So we should empower our kids to help them thrive.
Oh, Chantel, thank you so much. And honestly, Dr. Sonia and Courtney as well. I think it is so important for educators to normalize diversity because, let's be honest, our world is diverse. And so to only have 1 month or 1 day where we are representing a certain culture, as Dr. Sonia mentioned, is very damaging. And Chantel, the fact that all of these students are coming up to you after they figure out that you are of Indigenous heritage, like you're Métis and Cree, that they're like, oh, like I am too, like I'm this, I am that. And that's super powerful. And that kind of just reminds me on how we also need to diversify our educators. So that students can really see themselves represented. I know personally, being Filipina, a lot of the Filipinx students come up to me and they say like mabuhay, so hello in my language. And like, I'm Filipino too, or I had rice and spam this morning, kind of just connecting in that certain way. And that's something that I never had growing up because the majority of my teachers were white or white passing. So very important point that you brought up, Chantel. Thank you. My next question is for Dr. Sonia. And of course, again, Courtney and Chantel, if you'd like to jump in, feel free to. Dr. Sonia, do you think Alberta has made a notable effort to hire BIPOC educators? I just talked about this. What school districts are doing well, and what could they potentially improve on to encourage this?
That's a great question. Has the effort been there? I think we can always point and look for intentions and efforts being made. But Statistics Canada in 2016 had released information that our teaching force, coast to coast, is 86% white female. And so when we look at that, just a statistic in itself, and you compare that to our entire population in terms of who is in our classrooms, who is in our school systems, we put those two things together. Is the effort there? That's like almost a null and void question, because clearly we have not been able to diversify a workforce that is also reflective of the very students and the very population in which we exist on today. So in Alberta, I think there's different movements and policies and pieces coming out to address this. However, it's not in a way that's addressing the systemic racism at its root. And systemic racism is beyond that interpersonal experience that we all have had as racialized persons. It's going into the actual ways in which things are structured. Chantel had mentioned that before, the colonial structures, right? Like the way that our education system has been built and exists today. So for example, in Alberta, the inclusive education document that came out in 2013, race is only mentioned once in all the indicators of inclusion. So even that in itself we still are looking at different identity markers as like, well, here's part 1, check, part 2, check, gender, here's your sexuality, here's your age. We're looking at it in a way that is not holistic, that is not able to address the systemic discrimination and oppression that is occurring within our schools. So even with the efforts, I'm always very looking at things with a very critical lens in terms of, well, in this policy, is it there to question the very structures that have taken away from the voices of marginalized populations? Or are we trying to put it within a system in itself that cannot support this work, that cannot support diversifying our workforce, that cannot support the voices of our students, that break, almost that generational break where my experiences as a racialized woman growing up here in Calgary should not be the same stories that my son is saying, or the ones that my dad said because he immigrated here in the 60s, or 10 generations from now, they're still saying the same thing. That has not broken. So effort is very small part of the conversation. It's the results, it's the impact. That's the anti-racism part. And that's where we really need to hold account to our administrators, our elected officials, and have that unified voice with all of us saying, like, right now, it is not in balance. And that is impacting our students. That is still causing the same stories to be repeated that have a detrimental impact on our society.
And just to jump in to build on it too, is I don't actually know if the HR departments of the education system have actually figured out how to quantify the value of a diverse workforce. And I think it's how we think about it, right? I think really to build on this concept that we still view things in a very colonial way is I seem, my experience suggests that the way that we rank how we hire people is still based off of a very generic westernized set of qualifications. We professionalize, and which are all exceptionally valuable. I mean, I went through these systems myself so that I could find it, because you work within the system that you're given. But it's in these questions of where we're trying to make these shifts that you have to ask the question of, like, well, what's your goal and what's the outcome? Because on one hand, I think the way that people still see hiring diverse teachers is almost in the form of like an affirmative action still, right? It's in the numbers. It's, well, look how many we have, we're doing better, right? Versus the outcome. And the outcome that we're trying to achieve is a higher quality of education for our students. And the issue that I think that we still need, the cognitive dissonance that we're stuck with, is that to achieve a higher quality of outcome, you have to achieve representation amongst your actual educator group. The force of people that are going to be standing in front of those rooms will create that higher outcome. But it's hard to quantify on paper. It's hard to quantify on a resume or a TQS application, but it's seen. It's felt in the classroom. It's felt in those students that come say hi to you in the morning. It's felt in those students that see themselves in the person standing in front of them, and it's felt in the work that is produced when all of a sudden this, let's say the marker, the grader, can see the cultural context that is structured within, say, the essay that has been provided, realizes the magic that has gone into actually producing this project, this assignment, and grades it as such, versus someone who just would be unfamiliar and would maybe consider the semantics or the syntax of this conversation of the language to be incorrect or not proper English, versus being an intentional decision. But how do you quantify that? And I don't know if I figured it out either, but I'm also not in that role. But I think that's key, is to be able to figure that out.
Just to talk about that a little bit more. So our universities actually have been perpetuating this for generations. So most of the time universities are becoming more and more unattainable. I mean, just in the past few years of the latest government, we've had a 30% hike in tuition. And that makes it even more unattainable for people who are racialized, for people who have lower income, who've never really had those opportunities. And I think we need to look at that structure as a whole, because it has those ripple effects down to our kids. And then in turn, they're not going to see those faces. They're going to even have a harder time attending university. And so we need to start looking at more equity when it comes to education itself, when it comes not only to lower education, but higher education. Equity is it's a big word, it's a big concept, and there's a lot of people throwing it around. There's a lot of people throwing the word diversity around, or decolonizing the university around, but we need to see concrete action. And at this point, we're not, because if we were, we would see government step in to lower those tuitions and make things more attainable. We would see more grants. We would see more student associations that aren't just like, this is your racialized student association, have fun, but actually having more representation on campus so that we can share our stories. But not only that, having less siloing in universities for those diverse groups to actually come together to share our stories, and then put those pressures on governments to hold them accountable, but also on our institutions to hold them accountable. It is our job as adults to make sure that we're paving the way for our future generations.
Thank you all for sharing your responses and your insight on that. I think it was Dr. Sonia who said that a lot of our intentions and efforts are not holistic. And I see that echoed throughout Courtney's and Chantel's responses, where, we're kind of doing things like a checkbox or, all of that stuff, and we're not working together from top down, bottom up, to really ensure that we are diversifying everything as much as we can, as well as ensuring that we have the best quality, the highest quality of education for our students, which at the end of the day is why we became teachers or educators in the first place. And it kind of just reminds me of what Chantel, you were saying at the beginning of, I think it was in my relations, or all my relations. Yeah, all my relations. Yeah, how we're all in this together. And so, yeah, maybe we can diversify the educators at the lower levels, like elementary and high school, but maybe we're not seeing that in higher education. Maybe we're not seeing that in admin, or even, yes, in like government institutions. So if those with a lot of power, again, are primarily white, how are we really going to change the systems if we're not working holistically? So thank you to you three for your insightful answers on that. My next question is for Chantel. What are some basic practices you can recommend to teachers to decolonize their classroom while still being able to follow the curriculum and expectations of their jobs? And where's the balance?
Oh, this is a loaded question. I could talk for hours. Embracing those differences. I know I've come into classrooms and they're like, I don't see color. I'm like, well, then that's a terrible response. That's ridiculous, because we are living with this and we're experiencing it every day. But it's finding ways to really embrace, those differences, and embrace the things that kids are good at and what they're passionate about, and really taking it a step further. Like, we are all living this incredible experience together, but how do we get other kids to start talking to each other? If you witness bullying, just, I'm going to call your parents, but step in and be like, hey, why is this happening? Have a sharing circle with the group. Start actually holding not only the children accountable, but their parents accountable. They're bringing this language home from somewhere. And so let's talk about that. Let's have a conversation about that, but in a gentle way. It's not about accusing people, but it's about coming together so that we can change the way that we look at the world. We can change the way that we are judging people without even really recognizing it or knowing it. Even when I'm in schools, there'll be teachers that are really trying really hard, but then they don't realize that, there'll be some white children over there just causing a lot of problems. But then as soon as the one student of color reaches out or speaks out, all of a sudden they're like down like a hammer on that person. And I'm like, that is crazy to me. And sometimes I have actually stepped out. I'm like, you know what? I know you're hyperactive. I know you're, a racialized kid. Come and hang out with me. You're going to be my helper today. And I think it's recognizing those unconscious biases and holding ourselves accountable, but also holding those children in our class accountable by doing it in a gentle way. Use stories. Stories are an incredible way. When we share our personal stories and kids can relate to those stories, it really gives us a moment to think about things and to think of the way that we're experiencing the world around us. It gives those kids a moment to be like, yeah, I wouldn't want to feel like that. I'm so sorry for making you feel like that. And it gives those teachers a moment to be like, wow, I didn't realize I was looking through that lens at you, and I'm sorry. And being able to say you're sorry and being able to say that you've made a mistake, not only is that good for you, it's good for that child that you've affected, but it's good for all of the children in the classroom when you step up and say, I can fix this, and you can too.
I'll let Sonia, do you want to jump in first? I'm not sure. Okay. Like, yes. Just yes. Like, so much yes. This one for me is, it's really short. It is really short. And it's honestly, it's to remind teachers of the commitment that they make every year to their students, right? And it's this conversation that I hear amongst almost every educational circle, is that we're trying to create lifelong learners, right? Like, we say it in every context. We say, hey, we want to, like, lifelong learners, right? But I think maybe there is a little bit of self-reflection that needs to happen about our willingness to actually be lifelong learners. Because when I see things like this, I'm always a little, there's a level of angst and frustration that exists within it. We'd be like, how do we become this? Or how do we do this? And I ask the question, I'm like, well, what have you read? You know, what have you listened to? What have you learned? And like, I like asking the serious questions of just being like, hey, like, okay, like, you're a lifelong learner, right? You say that to your students all the time. What have you done? And we have all these skills. I think like that, like the actual ability to find this information, we have those skills and we use those skills daily. It's just about our intentionality of trying to learn things and then utilize what we learn, because what it comes down to for me is a simple thing. And it's, you teach what you know and you teach what you love. If you don't explore new things, then you don't know what to teach. And if you don't love what you've explored, you'll never teach it anyway. So if you really want to be a lifelong learner and you want to do this work, it just requires the intention and the action. And honestly, I think that's the baseline. Immediately within a year of doing a little bit of intentionality, your classroom is going to be like that much better.
Yeah, hearing the both of you speak to this, I think we all share that same sense of like passion, and also our heart just breaks, right? When you have that student in your classroom, or when you're walking into a classroom and you can see the ripple effects again of what has occurred in the past and continues to, and those racialized kids being called out, or again, good intentions, but maybe not having the knowledge there. And it's really I'm going to share a bit of a story, because just a couple years ago, I think it was a couple years ago, Bill 21, what's in the news right now, I was following very closely, where in Quebec, they're going to pass, now they have passing legislation where you cannot wear your articles of faith in order to become a secular society. Okay, I'm not going to get into the craziness of all of that, but I brought that to the students themselves because I just heard of it. This is a grade 7 and 8 and grade 9 groups that I brought it to. And we went on that journey together. We went and looked into that and asked those tough questions and brought in our own identities with that, or people that we knew who wore these articles of faith. As a Sikh woman, I have family members who wear the dastar, or the turban. And what would that mean? And I think it hit my students a lot once when I said, you know, this conversation has been so rich for the past 2 weeks. We've been talking about it every day. But as your teacher, I would not be allowed to teach if I wore my article of faith in front of you. And that just sparked a whole classroom, a whole environment where we walked together, students and teachers. And so, Chantal and Courtney, I think you would agree with this. It's when you are a teacher in the classroom, you have to recognize your position, what we talked about in the beginning. You also have to recognize the power that you hold, the power to oppress or the power to uplift. And with that, it's also about taking back from, easiest way to say it, like, don't have a power trip. Don't struggle for that power dynamic with your students. You do not need to be in control. You do not need to have that management aspect of working in your classroom, talking about these issues. Because kids today, and I think this is for every generation, but even more powerful than before, they have the terminology. They have the understanding. They are learning these things. They are talking about white privilege. They are talking about racism. They are talking about their gendered identity. They're talking about all of those things. But at some point, is it shut down in the classroom because we are too nervous to have that conversation? And that's when your power has to come back and go, wait a minute, let's walk on this together. Let's be empowered together and let's find the answers that we need together and question it more. And yes, it's going to be uncomfortable, but if anyone, teachers, anyone who's here, or if you have kids or you've worked with students, it's about being uncomfortable all the time. I mean, like from kindergarten, the sounds and smells that come out of a kindergarten classroom to what you're doing in high school with students. You are going to be uncomfortable on some level, but why can you not be it together? And your students will see that. They'll see that you're coming to this in a way that let's be uplifted together and ask those critical questions, because that's going to continue.
Okay, I'm loving like everything that is coming out of everyone's mouths right now. It's just so many golden nuggets. And of course, I can't help but agree. I think what I'm hearing from the three of you is just maybe reminding ourselves and our students that we are human and we do bring our own perspective and experiences to the table. And as Dr. Sonia mentioned, that has the power to oppress, but also the power to uplift. And I really enjoyed that statement of being empowered together, really exploring and being uncomfortable and growing together. I think with, to kind of touch on Dr. Sonia, kind of sharing a personal story, and Chantel, your advice at the beginning on using stories as a way to learn, I thought that was really powerful because we just learned a little something with the power of storytelling. It is such a privilege to hear people's stories, and I do think that it is such a great way to learn more about the world and more about each other. Whether it's through actual books that we're reading, or an educator kind of talking about their experience, or a student talking about their experience, or even the music we listen to. It's telling a story. There's so much power in storytelling, and so much we can learn and appreciate about the world around us. So thank you. My final question for you folks tonight, and this is open to all, feel free to jump on each other, but I feel like I don't need to remind you of that anymore, is what do you think our educational leaders need to do right now in order to ensure the next generation are anti-racists? And what do we need from leadership in schools around advancing and learning anti-racism practice?
Don't all fight for this one. Chantel, no, please.
Oh yeah, I was going to say lead by example. Calling what you see out, especially in your peers and your colleagues. Sometimes it's really difficult, but also holding each other accountable. I know that I've been in some schools, and a lot of racialized teachers will come to me and be like, hey, this is the problem we're having with our racialized students, and their voices aren't feeling, they aren't being heard. And how do we fix that? We fix that with the admin. We fix that with, the higher ups within the school board. We want to see more representation in the school board itself, from like our counselors within the school board, for different jurisdictions as well. We want those voices to be heard and not oppressed. It's not enough to have somebody stepping into those roles if their voice isn't being heard. They're like, well, look, we have a person, who's Indigenous on our board, but they don't talk because you just negate everything that they say, or you belittle them, or you just completely ignore them, especially when it comes to Indigenous women. We're thrown into these roles where we do all the work, but then our value is not it's not honored, it's not shared. It's really, really difficult, and that comes with any racialized group. And we're starting to see that more and more, that we're put into these tokenistic roles, but our voices are not resonating through those roles. And so I think we need to really start elevating those roles and shutting down those other voices if they're not making the changes that are needed. It's recognizing the changes that are needed in the system and holding people accountable, but also pushing forward those voices that are making those changes. Change is uncomfortable, but it's important. We are in a completely different world than we were even 10 years ago, even 20 years ago. So why aren't we making the changes to keep up with, our social attitudes and dynamics, and the way that our populations have changed and our technology? Why aren't we changing with it to be able to embrace our future and all of our future generations. We need to do that together, and accountability is a big one. And it's recognizing that there are going to be power dynamics that are going to make people uncomfortable, but it's taking a deep breath and it's speaking out loudly. I'm a loud speaker, so that helps, but it's something that we need to do, no matter how uncomfortable it makes us. And we need to stop living in fear. If you didn't sit silent, because silence is complicity. Hi.
Sonia, please. You look like you're about to click that unmute. Don't hesitate.
Okay, just in case I lose my train of thought, because I think we could talk about this for a long, long time, because this is like not even scratching like the surface. Right? This is something that I can tell all of us are heavily invested in our lives, right? As a day-to-day practice. But going back to leadership or administration, bottom line, name it. Name your position, your identity, the power and the privileges that come with it. In my 15 years of teaching, I have had one person in leadership say, as a white man, I don't know this, this, this. And for me, I was stunned into silence. I was like, that just happened? You just said that? Because I have worked with administration, I have worked with leaders, I've worked with teachers who are so afraid to name that because they don't know what that means or that conversation is going to go. And it lends it's because we have a society that has made it very binary in terms of like racist bad, not racist good. And so everyone is on this bandwagon of trying to prove that they're not racist. But we're in a day and age now, it's not enough to even say that. We have to be anti-racist, and all of us are part of this system. All of us are in these classrooms. All of us are part of a school that has racism within curriculums. It has it within our experiences. It is there, and it needs to be named. So even for a leadership and administration, I implore anyone who is in a leadership or admin position who is on this right now, ask yourself, what professional learning, professional development, what podcasts, who have you spoken to? It kind of comes back to Courtney, you had said, what are you listening to? Who are you talking to? Who is in your like circles? Where are you actively engaged in this? Where are you talking about this? And then critically reflecting on your own self. Because especially now, I think because it's been so heightened and amplified with the murder of George Floyd and the movement that we've seen, especially in North America around this, and then the recovery of Indigenous children at residential schools. This work and this is all, it has all been here. It's only being revealed now. So for any leadership or administration, and this goes to teachers too, saying that I'm uncomfortable, I'm nervous about this, get over it. There's no time for it anymore, because it has been here forever. It is continuing to be in the lives of our students. And so get out there, do the hard work, because it will pay off at the end. You are going to its core uplifting human dignity in the lives of people, and they're going to grow into that and afford human dignity to the others around them, right? So leaders, admin, if you haven't done it yet, or you're nervous about it, or you have been called out in some way, and that rarely ever happens, it's time to do some critical work on the inside and get out there and increase your repertoire around this. Because again, what you don't know, but how are you going to lead in that area? That you are a leader for a reason. You have been there. And last but not least, I just have to say this because I think this is something that I would really implore schools to do. This came out in my own research, but we're talking about accountability and impact. Wouldn't it be amazing, just ideally, think about this, if teachers, you could be evaluated by your students and what you're bringing into the classroom, and administration and leaders, you are evaluated by your teachers. What community would that bring to us in opening that up, being vulnerable, finding humility, but walking together? So I have yet to see a board do that, but I'm going to put that out there into the universe to manifest that in this space here today. Thanks.
All right, so I should have gone first. That's what I just learned from the two of you. I'm going to take this lesson for next time. I'm going to take that first button every time. I think for me, the reflection that often comes up in this is the culture that you experience in your schools is also the culture that you cultivate. And I'm always trying to remind people of this. I'm like, if you don't like what you're seeing, ask yourself, how did you create this space. And I say that specifically to speak to Dr. Sonia's comments earlier on power, right? There's I think a denial or maybe a little bit of an ignorance of the power that teachers and educators and administrators hold. And when you are in denial, or when you have not accepted the roles, the power that comes with it, then you are unable to accept the accountability. You are unable to accept responsibility for the culture that you're cultivating in your schools, in your safe spaces, if they even are safe, right? And this is where, for me, it always is. It's if you create a culture of absolute humility, if you create a culture where mistakes are the norm and they are celebrated, then when you go ahead and do this work, you'll do it in a culture that embraces the fact that you're challenging yourself to grow. And if I talk about you teach what you love, I also talk about you should model what you teach, right? Of course, and as educators, if you've created this culture of safety around mistakes, then you can go ahead and make mistakes. And I think that in this work, as lifelong learners, not as this absolute leader standing at the front of the class with all the answers, which we know, of course, many students look at us that way. We need to change that, because we need young people to understand you never have all the answers. That's the lesson they have to take away, that you'll never have all the answers. You must always look, must always get as many perspectives as possible. So if you're an educator, showing that, it's terrifying. But the reason why I wish I had gone first is because of the fact that what these two women have said is exactly this idea that it's scary, but when you do that work, you change people's lives, human beings that will grow up and change someone else's life. You create a ripple effect. And I think what we all know is something that if we really take our job seriously, we want our students to be better than us. And for them to be better than us, we have to be humble enough to know that we still need to grow. So that culture that you're experiencing in a classroom, it's the culture that you've cultivated. So just cultivate a different one. And that takes work, that takes time, but it's invaluable.
Just kind of wanted to add, if we look at relationships as an investment, I think that's so important. Because we're investing in our future generations. We might not see that investment pay off within our own lifetime, but we will later on, as long as we're putting in that effort and really honoring those relationships and cultivating them in a good way. It's like laying seeds in the ground. What seeds are you going to grow? Are you going to grow something that's just going to grow this tall, or something that is going to, be a beanstalk that's going to touch the clouds? It's empowering not only the kids that you're working with, but also your colleagues to be able to grow. And that's huge, by saying, you know what, yes, I care for you. I am compassionate about all that you're going through right now. And it's hard to be able to put people in the perspective of everyone is a person. Everyone is a human being. Whenever I talk to kids, I'm like, you know what? I make mistakes. I think one of my biggest teachings, and I made a lot of mistakes in my 20s. So, but that's how you learn. You don't know. If you don't make mistakes, you don't know. So you have to continuously make mistakes, and it's okay. Just like a baby, when it's walking, it falls how many times before finally it can run and then get into too much trouble. But it's a gift. It's a gift to be able to see that growth, not only within yourself, within your students, but also within all of those relationships that we have around us.
Wow. Being a young and limited experience educator, I definitely have made a lot of mistakes. I'm also in my 20s, so I'm just like making mistakes in my personal life and as well and in my career. And I'm not quite sure where this humility and where this acceptance of I don't have all the answers come from, but I do see it in my kids where, they ask me questions. I'm like, I actually don't know. Let's spend some time at the end of class to look into this and stuff. And it's become something that I look forward to, for them asking me questions that I actually don't know and just exploring it together. And then it creates this this culture of curiosity where they're like, what about this? Like, what about this question? And I learn something new each time. And I think it is touching back on relationships as an investment, where our relationship right now, we're investing in that and really creating or cultivating that culture, as Courtney was saying, where mistakes are the norm and we're connecting as human beings. So yeah, just straight facts that you all said with this last questions. I'm very inspired, and I'm very impressed with all that you folks have done. And I hope to, as a young educator, to take away everything that you folks have said, not just with this last question, but everything that you've said throughout, to ensure that my students are better than who I am. So thank you. All right, that's all the questions that I have for you personally, but I would like to open up question period to any of our viewers. If you're curious about a little something that you would like to put out, now's the time. All right, question number 1. Whew. Do you have any recommendations for how we as parents can have conversations with teachers about what content they're delivering and whose voices they're amplifying without coming off as micromanaging or accusing? That's a good question.
So I'm a mom. I have 4 kids, all with special needs, and we're all Indigenous. So I have recognized some unconscious biases that a lot of teachers will have. And so it's coming at them in more of a gentle way, saying, hey, can we sit down? Can I bring you a coffee? Can we just have a conversation after school if you have time, or before school if you have time? Because I just want to share with you how I'm feeling and see if we can come up with solutions to really change the way that we're looking at things. It's really recognizing that sometimes people don't realize that they have that unconscious bias. So just being open to start that dialogue, to start that relationship, that's a huge step. It takes a lot of bravery on your behalf, but it also takes a lot of bravery on theirs, and a lot of humility for sure, to be able to be open. And if you're not able to get through by starting that dialogue, by starting that relationship, I mean, we have parent-teacher interviews all the time, so that's a good place to start. Although they're so short. I'm sorry, as a parent and as a teacher, like, they're ridiculously short. How are you supposed to put in the work that needs to happen? I think we need to look at the structures that are in place within our own admin and be like, we need time. We need time to cultivate these relationships, because how are you supposed to be a good teacher if you don't have a relationship with your students, if you don't understand how to build a relationship with their parents? Because you are such a huge part and an invaluable part of these kids' lives. You're shaping and molding them. And one misstep can break a child and they can fall through the cracks. And so this is why it's important as educators to be open to hear what a parent might have to say, to hear some recommendations that a parent might have to say. When teachers used to talk to my son, they didn't realize he had autism because they didn't bother reading his chart. And they were like, he's just problematic. I'm like, no, he's autistic. And so when they finally realized that, and when I was very gentle with the way I was speaking to them about, okay, these are his triggers, these are the things, some of the teachers, and I think it was just having those initial conversations over a coffee, or just being open to say, you know what, we're not perfect, and that's okay. I know as a mom, I sometimes can get pretty over defensive because these are my babies, but it's important to start that dialogue, or else nothing is going to change.
I would just like to expand on what you were saying, Chantel, on kind of inviting that conversation and building that relationship, and touching back to what Dr. Sonia was saying on, building things holistically, where parents are the primary educators of the children that we teach. And it's so important to build that relationship between home and school in order for us to raise the child holistically. And yes, at the end of the day, we're educators. This is what we went to school for, and this is our profession. But to have, again, the humility of maybe gaining some perspective of a parent, or even from the parent's perspective, gaining some humility and understanding maybe what a teacher is going through currently, and opening that dialogue, being vulnerable with one another, and seeing how you can work together to improve not only your relationship with each other, but improve the quality of education for your child. So yeah, shout out to you, Chantel. That was amazing. Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Sonia.
Thanks. I'll keep this short. Chantal, your story resonates with me on so many levels. Also 3 children at home, and but beyond that, I've worked with so many parents who have sought me out in the schools where I've worked to express their inability to be able to come across and be heard. And I think we have to recognize this is an example of systemic racism, structural barriers, because all too often it's falling on parents, individuals, to try to fix a broken system. And the system that I'm talking about is, how are we making it accessible to our parents who have not historically had a voice, or the communities, those students who have not had a voice in feeling heard and being able to confront and name, again, the biases and the stereotypes that are coming at them. I don't think we have that yet. And so leadership, administration, districts, but our education as a whole, we don't have a structure that can allow for accountability. Again, Courtney, what you said, that humility coming in, that gentle ease of working together, it is falling often too much on individual parents. And my research and research overall, just recently in the last 4 years, I did a study around Calgary parents and surrounding area. 90% of families are saying, I tried and I didn't get anywhere. So now I've shut down and I'm just trying to get my child through the system. That is unacceptable. It's heartbreaking, but it's a reality I think we need to also start naming, because it cannot rely on individuals anymore to do this. And I think we need to really push that beyond school councils or parent council meetings. That's one way of being able to have access to the school, and it does not work because that in itself is a structure that, apart from language, just the very Robert's rules that are enacted around it, it doesn't allow for voices to be shared. But I'll stop there. Go ahead, Courtney.
Just this one's actually quick. So from, like, I love the parent's perspective, and I just thought I'd offer the teacher's perspective as well too. And I think I swear this is not a plug. This is natural. This just came up. But like as I mentioned earlier, teachers, we teach what we know, right? And I think there's absolutely a fear. So sometimes the rejection I think that teachers provide to parents, it's self-protection as well too. Because I think in many ways teachers are afraid of, like, well, like I would do that, but I actually don't know how to do that. And that acknowledgement is like terrifying. And many teachers aren't really comfortable or have, and this is just in all honesty from personal experience, we have a lot of bad experiences that sometimes when we do admit our deficiencies, that actually is coming back on us again. But I think that's like a systemic issue that we've created beyond just this one individual classroom, right? The concept of deficiencies as an educator is something that is looked so far down upon that we try our hardest, I believe, to achieve excellence based off of the standard that we're held to. And that standard is a colonial standard. So this is a challenging, there's layers to kind of piece apart here to get to that core of it. And that's actually why the Culture Commons is so interesting. And why I was happy to be a contributor is because now as parents, if you were to come to me as an educator and say, hey, like, I would love it if you could teach diverse voices in some context here. And I'd be like, well, I'm not really sure how to do that. And you were like, well, don't worry. There's a resource. I'm not saying you're going to succeed, but I'm saying you're actually, like, you've broken down a barrier. The barrier of knowledge and the barrier of access. This is a resource that identified a gap for educators to say, hey, you might not have time to go out and do all of this work. So we're going to do some of it for you because this is restorative justice. We're going to try and like really bring this system back up to par, recognizing the gaps that it is, to try and help you out. And for me, like, if someone would say, hey, like, I know I have a short story that fits into the grade 12 English curriculum that I promise my child, like, not even if you want to promise a child, but it's like you'll have some great outcomes with students of diversity in your class, that something you might be interested in, that hits the curricular outcomes. Bang, bang, you've just nailed all of the different things that I'm most interested in as an educator. And I'm like, well, like, I can't say no now. And it's that's a massive barrier that Canadian Cultural Mosaic Foundation has worked to break down. And from a systemic point of view, it's very valuable to an educator.
Just to tie into that, yes, resources are so important because I find, especially as like racialized teachers or racialized educators that come in, people will ask us questions and just rely on the questions rather than doing the work themselves. So it's nice to be like, here's a resource. I'm not going to answer all of your questions today. I'm busy. Bye. So-
Yes, preach. Honestly, preach. So yeah, I'm also grateful for Culture Commons. It's something that I use in my classroom. Eliminates so many things that teachers have to think of, whether it's connecting it to the curriculum, but also they're reviewed by the communities that we are representing. So you know that it is as authentic as it can be. So you know what? Shameless plug. Culturecommons.ca. It was mentioned several times throughout this discussion. Check it out. So in the interest of time, I know that a lot of you folks watching right now are so curious and intrigued and very much engaged in the conversation. We will only be taking the next 3 questions, but I'm so grateful for the curiosity that is coming out, and I hope that maybe we can connect, whether you want to send an email out to kind of get your questions answered. The next question is, do you have thoughts on school resource officers? So quite broad. So if anyone wants to start with this, by all means.
I don't mind starting with this one because I have been a past volunteer with the Calgary Police Service, and the school resource officer program has it's come up a lot. And just to contextualize this, it's so my informed opinion is that it doesn't work. It's not of any benefit. And that goes into looking historically at how police forces, militarism overall, have existed to function and who it has detrimentally oppressed, and that is the Black and brown bodies of our current day society historically. So for me, the symbolism with that, the historical piece of that, that's an example of systemic racism that needs to be named and addressed. I also know of 2 persons who colleagues, friends now, who have been in the role of a school resource officer. And it has been a conversation where my opinion has really become a point of offense, and being very, like, they were very offended that oh my gosh, you look at me like this. And I think that's where we need to shift the conversation. Again, know that when we're talking about racism, systemic racism, anti-racism, you need to, yes, start with the individual, but now it's not it's not your own experience. It's not who you were coming into that role. It is the pattern of what that role has represented over time, and a program that goes to give consequences in a way that is absolutely detrimental. My age is going to be very much known here if you haven't figured out already, but I went to high school here in the 90s, and the school resource officer that I had a huge impact on me in a negative way, with a smile. As the brown bodies in our school terrified, the brown and Black boys in our school, ones that I grew up with, who are my friends, knew that they were going to be in trouble for ridiculous things. They were going to be policed. We were going to have presence at our aftergrad, all of these pieces. And again, that voice of students, you are in such a vulnerable place where that power is so oppressive that it took me how many years afterwards to be able to speak about this articulately and eloquently and be able to come back against the arguments that are like, but it's a very necessary program because it's building relationships in community. There are many ways to build relationships in community. And I'm going to put that out there and end here, that school resource officer is a not needed program. It's archaic. It is detrimental. And if we want to revisit it, it has to be generations from now, coming from the generations of students that think it's needed in their schools. Their voices need to be heard.
Yeah, just to echo that, I know that I grew up in school in the 90s too. So, and it was really hard. I would walk through the door as soon as I would see that officer, I would get really upset, and they would follow me around the school. And I'm white passing, but they knew I was Indigenous. And as soon as they found that out, they would follow me. And I was quite friendly. And I was like, hey, why are you following me? And they're like, well, you know. And I'm like, no, I don't. But I witnessed all of these injustices that were happening on his watch, how, we were being mistreated by, non-Indigenous or non-racialized students. But that officer wasn't stepping in to do anything about it, even though there was, a lot of assault that was happening in that school. But if it was a white student, unfortunately, doing that assaulting, nothing would come of it. But if you even looked the wrong way at a teacher, you could be detained for who knows how long. And it was terrifying. And even now, it's almost like as soon as you put that officer in the school, it's like you're expecting something to happen. You're not letting those kids take responsibility for themselves and their outcomes. You're just saying, we know you're bad, so this is who you get. And that's not okay. That's not a good way to build relationships within the community. That's not a good way to build relationships within the police service either. And so we need to really, I agree, abolish that role and look at other ways that we can do outreach within the community.
And just to like, honestly, so much has been said so eloquently and effectually that I don't need to really harp on it. But I think the only thing I can comment is that I'm a utilitarian and I'm an outcomes-based thinker. And when I look at my students and as an educator, I always got to ask the question of like the programs that we're offering in our schools have to serve the purpose of creating better lives for these students. And where are we spending our money? So this is a line that I use a little bit differently now as a counselor. I always commented that our budgets are moral documents. They expose where we put our values, right? Where you put your money is what you value. So your budget is a moral document. And when I think of the education system, and I think of even the CPS, like in Calgary specific, but in other police forces across the world, is like how you spend money determines what you value. And if the outcome that we're looking toward with these young people is better mental health, community connections, where a better understanding of self, better understanding of others, is this supporting that outcome? Like, just, is this really drawing us closer to that outcome, or is it drawing us closer to a place where, well, people feel policed? And there's just it's a challenge to administrators, right? It's a challenge to the fact that, superintendents of some of the major boards often sit on the same foundations. Like, for example, the superintendent of the CB sits on the Calgary Police Foundation's board. There are interconnected aspects of it that we have to challenge ourselves to say, is this going to serve the outcome that we claim to be driving toward? And historically, the answer is no. And yet here we are continually defending the system. And I think at some point we just got to be honest with ourselves, and that if we're not achieving the outcomes we're looking for, then we got to just change the system. And that's okay. That's actually what growth and evolution is. That's what transformation is.
Yeah, that's so true. The systems aren't working. What else can we do besides change them? Our next question. Do you have any suggestions for what we can do about getting Black history into our curriculum? We need a revolution here. Anyone? The floor is yours.
I'm gonna jump in on this real quick. Just teach teachers, right? So ironically, the place that I actually would like to challenge the most is post-secondaries, right? I just really want to suggest that this is actually really hard to tell people, but building these relationships takes so much time. Building this knowledge base takes so much time. And because we're dealing in a world where we are trying to correct historical injustices that are hundreds and thousands of years old, hundreds and thousands, not hundreds of thousands, that of course we want it now. Of course we do. We wish someone did this 30 years ago. We wish someone did it 40 years ago, but people are starting to do it right now. So we need to be very active in the relationships we build and understand that just like young people, how we're impacting the next generation, we're also impacting the next generation of teachers as well too. So I personally am really focused on supporting post-secondaries in helping them as they're developing the next generation of educators, their new canon, their new understanding of knowledge. If we do that there, every year, a new generation of teachers goes into a school, and all of a sudden, it just becomes a part of what they teach because they teach what they know. Separately, simultaneously, we got to keep working on Alberta education on that one as well too, and all of your provincial boards, because the alternative is that teachers will teach what we're told to. So that works too. And I think it's going to go both ways Because the last thing that I will say is there are a lot of teachers out there that are just doing this work on their own. And they don't have the resources, they don't have the time or the expertise because they're alone. So providing that support as a community while simultaneously pulling at the levers of change that are necessary to create that sustainability, that sustainable education of Black history, of a variety of diverse histories. Pull those levers, write your MLAs, write Alberta Ed, write every aspect you need to, talk to your universities, talk to your post-secondaries, and you start to change the system in very effective, immediate, and measurable ways.
I know that the curriculum that was actually supposed to be released before the curriculum that just is coming down the pipe now had way more inclusion, way more diversity. It was arts-based, it was concept-based. It was brilliant because it had different ways of letting every student thrive in their own way and be proud of who they were and be able to express themselves fully and completely. And there was so much information in there of the contributions that people who are racialized, people who are Indigenous, people who are Black, or from anywhere around the world, the contributions that they have made to make an incredible difference to this province, to the city, to this country. And it was so brilliant, but then that kind of got kiboshed. And when teachers stood up and tried to advocate for that curriculum that was supposed to come out before that and against the curriculum that they're trying to push forward, none of those voices were heard. They were in fact silenced completely, even though the AFA, Alberta Foundation, sorry, AFA, yeah. No, that's not right. It's the Alberta Teachers Association, ATA. There we go. Even though they unanimously, well, almost unanimously, voted to, have Adriana LaGrange step down, it didn't matter. She just stayed there. So what kind of a message is that sending to our teachers? What kind of a message is that sending to our students? What kind of a message is that sending to, all of Alberta? It's like, it doesn't matter what you want. We're going to infantilize you as Albertans and not care about what you want for your future because it's about us. And so I think we need to really hold our politicians accountable and put the people into those roles who will make those changes and really advocate. What a leader is, it's not somebody who's just in charge. A leader is someone who leads by example. A leader is someone who amplifies the voices within their community, and it's not about ego. It's about spirit and, our heart and connection and relationships. That's what a true leader is. So sorry about the rant.
No, it's my turn to go. Okay, I don't have much to add on that part. But I think it's two things. First, teachers, the curriculum is but one tool that you have in your classroom and in your schools. And you are allowed to critique and critically look at the curriculum as it stands and bring your students into that. What is missing? Name it. Bring it back to the students because it is a curriculum of life. It is a curriculum of being. It is being together within that. What are we not talking about? Let's bring the Black histories into here. And this is Culture Commons. You have the lesson on Amber Valley. I didn't know about Amber Valley up until 3 years ago, right? The first Black pioneer settlement in Alberta, and how that changed and what happened there and the racism that was fed in there for us to not only not know that history, but the communities and stuff, the Ukrainian communities, Polish communities, all of these different histories that are excluded. So when we're talking about inclusive curriculums, and this is just the one line that you can constantly say to, yes, your board of trustees, your elected officials, the ATA, where professional development is happening, to your teacher colleagues, is like when we're talking about inclusion in the classroom, let's start with what and who has been excluded. And the curriculum is excluding many. And we need to name that and recognize that, because the change, yes, it will come with us individuals in the classroom. It will come as like with all of us working together. And that's when your elected officials start to listen and look, because we are using that language, the language by which they are promoting a curriculum. This is inclusion, this is diverse, this is equitable, and go, well, wait, what's the opposite of that? And that's where we need to focus in our attentions, because curriculum in terms of like even what's going on in the States right now where critical race theory is being attacked, that's coming here. If not, it's already here, because our borders any border does not, it's permeable. We're all coming with these ideas because people are threatened by talking about what has been excluded. So the curriculum of exclusion, let's call it that. Let's go with the curriculum of exclusion and bring that up now. And Culture Commons is one tool, but this is powerful because when elected officials or government see, well, this is being used and we didn't address that gap, that's when the power starts to come back and go, wait, we need to do something and we need to put those people back into those roles. And I won't comment anymore on the current government right now because that will be a whole other conversation.
Preach is all I can say. Yeah. Okay, this is our last question. Thank you all. Beautiful. It often seems like the education system shuts out the voice of racialized parents, particularly when there are only white educators in the school, or they defer to a token person of color. What have you seen parents of color do to lobby for anti-racist action in their child's school?
I just want to actually share a story. So I empower my kids with culture. And my girls, they had entered my care as kinship a few years ago. And before that point, they really hadn't been raised with a lot of our culture. And now they're starting to really embrace it. And it's such a gift. My youngest son, he went to a school and he was so upset. He comes home to me. He's like, Mom, they're not doing anything for Indigenous or Aboriginal Awareness Day. At the time, it was Aboriginal Awareness Day. Now it's National Indigenous Day because, of course, it's kind of evolved and changed. He's like, can you come in and talk to my school? I'm like, no, buddy, I'm at like 5 other schools that day. So what are you going to do about it? And he's like, well, I'm going to go and I'm going to wear my ribbon shirt and I'm going to wear my Métis sash and I'm going to go from class to class drumming and singing. So when he had asked his principal about why weren't they doing anything, she was like, well, it's not important. But then when he went to his vice principal after he had said, this is important to me. I need to see myself in the school. They need to understand who I am. They have to understand our family history and our connection to the land. And they have to understand how important it is to celebrate everyone. When he explained that, his vice principal was like, yes, absolutely, do it. So he went from class to class to class, sharing stories and our songs and talking about his ribbon shirt and showing that pride in who he was as an Indigenous young man. And of course, I was like, oh, yes, I'm a baby. But the principal went and took a picture of him and put it on the Twitter saying, look, this is what we're doing for National Indigenous Day. I'm like, don't you tokenize my child when you wouldn't even let him speak out? So I think we need to find more powerful advocates within our schools, and those who get put in that tokenized role need to step up and say, hey, stop making me a token, because we have so much more to give than just simply being that racialized person in that role. We have to elevate the voices of not only our students, but those teachers or those parents as well, and say, you know what, I hear you, I see you, and let's work together to make those changes happen. And it's hard because you feel as a parent, yeah, it's overwhelming. You're so busy, not only raising your kids, but also, you're working, you're doing all of these other things. But we need to have a voice, within those classrooms. You're shaping and molding our children. I want to make sure that my kid's voice is being recognized, but also I want to be able to help empower the teachers to be able to bring those issues forward to their administration, to their principal or vice principal, and be able to not only elevate the voices of my own group, but all groups within the school who are marginalized, whose voices need to be heard, and we need to step forward and amplify the voice of our entire community. Everyone has value. And I think as soon as we start to devalue people, this is where we start to see more and more inequity in our society. So it's empowering all our teachers as well as our educators to be able to step up and say, this isn't right. Let's fix it.
I just want to really, again, I think many times in this event so far, the collective knowledge that's in this space, it makes you almost just want to sit back and watch yourself, and then you're like, oh, I'm on the panel. Because what Chantal has put forward here is so important, and it's community will change more than an individual. And what I found the most successful thing that's ever really shifted my understanding of a scenario, and not just me personally, but like really the administration that I've worked with, has been when a collection of voices sat down and offered a partnership in the work to move forward with me. And like in that collection of voices, it wasn't isolated. You weren't secluded, you felt supported, and the work wasn't just that one parent's, right? Like that one parent didn't have to carry that weight. It was in that that community that brought this forward. It brought with it all of a sudden almost like you felt an impetus to act, right? You saw and you heard because you heard it from so many different directions. And that was a very powerful thing to see the community engage with the school that I was in. And it was in that moment that even though this was a singular isolated incident, you realized what it meant to be empowered. And being empowered is more than just being heard as an individual, but almost like being heard as a collective, and being able to gather up those voices together and have something to say. And when parents do that, and whether or not it is like BIPOC parents, the Black parents get together, because sometimes that's a culture that you might need to like be a part of. You might need to be in a room full of people who know exactly what you're going through, not just like kind of, but exactly what it is you're experiencing. You might need that support. That goes so far, and I've seen it change things at a school level, and I've also seen it change things at an administrative level. And so you build that community. We listen.
I have nothing to add to that, because that's the success that I've seen in my own experiences. Is it's not on one person, but it comes to 2 or 3, and you have to find your people, the ones who want to bring this up to the administration. So that, yeah, it comes down to community right now, until we can have more channels that we can feel safer to have this as parents, as racialized parents, having these conversations. But do protect yourself, keep your child safe, keep them close to your heart. And if it is too much, do not feel any shame or any burden on you that you were not able to make a difference. Step back, find your space, and go, be with yourself. And you don't have to take this all on, because it's a lot of work, but do find the support in community.
Such powerful words from you folks. Chantal, you want to jump in?
Yeah, well, I just kind of wanted to echo what Courtney said. So it is important to actually have relationships between other parents in the school too, because I know I'm loud. And so there was a lot of racialized parents that would come to me and be like, hey, can you talk to these people for me? And so it's really cultivating those relationships and knowing it's good for all of your kids. If even one person has a strong voice and they can step up, this is what an ally is. It's someone who amplifies those voices who are being negated, those voices who are not being heard. And so as an ally, you can step into those roles and say, hey, you know what? I'm hearing this from other teachers, or I'm hearing this from other parents. So I'm going to bring it to the administration because they'll actually listen to me because I'm a white dude, things like that. But yeah, those relationships within our community, within our school communities is so important. But it's also, how do we cultivate that within our classroom? How do we introduce parents to each other? Do we have like a parent social night so that we can address those issues in a good way? But also, why aren't we building those relationships between parents and between teachers, as opposed to, once every, 3 months when we have our parent-teacher interviews? We need more than that, because this is a huge part of those little people's lives.
Yeah, building that community, honestly, is just so powerful. Yeah, we have more power and more strength together. So. All right, so that is all the time we have for today. I just want to thank not only our 3 panelists today, so Dr. Sonia, Chantal, and Courtney, for joining us, but as well as Iman for getting this event together, and all of the people watching tonight. I'm so grateful to have been your host for tonight. I've learned so much, and I hope that you folks learned a little something too. Yes, of course.
Hi, everyone. Miigwech. Thank you so much.